What's up, mountain bikers? Jeff Bryans here, back with a review of the Specialized Epic 8 Evo Comp. I'm going to try something a little different with this review and actually summarize my findings right off the bat. Think of this as my attempt to Quentin Tarantino my review, giving you, the viewer, something a bit more to chew on right from the get-go. Those looking for more details, don't worry, they're coming later. But in the ADHD TikTok-ish era, I thought it'd be fun to mix it up. So with that said, let's just jump into this one. The Epic 8, it's a great bike, but I'm struggling to be as excited about it as maybe I would have been a handful of years ago. Don't mishear what I'm saying. It's a fun bike that checks a lot of boxes for any rider looking for an aggressive 120 mil travel bike that is still a formidable tool in the occasional cross-country race. But if I'm honest, I haven't fallen in love with this bike the way I fell in love with, say, the Transition Spur or Specialized Enduro. Those bikes had me wowed right from the start and were individually very special for reasons that I've spent years trying to understand. On paper, the Epic 8 Evo is a super cool bike. 120 mil of travel out back, 130 mil fork, geometry that favors that active, aggressive riding, in-frame storage, room for 2 water bottles, and very favorable suspension kinematics. On trail, however, I've just sort of been unenthused about the bike. Does this mean it's a step behind the Spur? 100% no, that's not true. It's right there with the best of them. But frankly, I had expectations coming to this review that were kind of above and beyond any bike in this category. Is that fair? Probably not. But I just know this bike's not materially better than any of the other 120 mil flex stay bikes out there with favorable geometry. It's also nothing special when it comes to things like value or weight or part selection. Again, I want to be clear, I have a blast riding it, but if you already own a bike like it, I wouldn't rush out to buy an Epic 8. In fact, if push came to shove and I had identical build kits on the Epic 8 and the Spur, I'd be really torn. On one hand, I do feel the Spur rides a touch better in a downhill setting, primarily because it has a bit more lateral flex. The bike doesn't beat me up quite as bad on the hairy trails, and it holds traction a touch better when I'm kind of on the edge of traction. On the other hand, I do appreciate the efficiency of the Epic 8, has great mid-stroke support, and I love the fact it has room for 2 water bottles and in-frame storage. That's awesome. So yeah, I guess I'd call it a tie, which frankly should leave me raving about this bike considering how much I love the Spur. Maybe it's got to do with the fact that Spur was kind of the first bike like this that I really fell in love with, and the Epic 8 breaks no new ground to me. Regardless, I've been scratching my head as to why I'm not more excited about this bike. So with that said, I know you guys probably are dying for more. I hope so. So let's get into the details here. Let's go back to the start and talk about why I even bought this bike. Those who have followed my channel for a while know that I have been looking for a bike that blends just the right amount of cross-country raciness and downhill prowess. Obviously, you guys know that. Something that has like enough travel to take the sting off things, make riding fun, geometry that encourages more active and aggressive riding, basically the opposite of a road bike. But I'm still looking for a bike that's light, efficient, and well-suited to the occasional more raw cross-country race, something like the Big Sky Biggie. Obviously, the Epic 8 Evo is aiming squarely at all of those requirements. So I put my order in this spring through the shop Ruby Canyon in Grand Junction. I love those guys. Ryan is a buddy, and I encourage you all to check him out. There's my plug for the review. Okay, for a number of reasons, I went with the Evo Comp model and what I can only call a very girly shade of purple. Lots of positive comments on the paint job, 0 from men. Take that for what it's worth. I chose this model simply based on price. Sure, GX is kind of boring, code breaks a bit on the heavy side, and the wheel is the most obvious thing to upgrade as soon as possible, I guess. But overall, you get a very trailworthy package at a significant savings compared to the pricier models. Speaking of price, value is very much in the eye of the buyer. I know inflation is real, and I also know a carbon bike with any emphasis on weight will push bike costs very quickly. At around $5,000, I don't think this bike is an amazing value, nor do I think it's a bad value. Take that for what it's worth. Kind of right in the middle. Setup was very straightforward. I'll put my suspension settings in the description, and weight was right around 28 pounds. Again, it's not great, it's not bad. All things considered, you could easily get this bike down to the 26s with a better set of wheels and some race rubber. And that's just light enough, in my opinion, to be a formidable tool on the race course. Oh, and there is a flip chip in the rear shock, which barely makes a difference to the bike's geometry. It's so subtle, I'd wager most riders, like 99% of riders, will not notice what configuration it's in, so we're not even going to talk about that. Before I get into riding the bike, I do want to mention the changes Specialized made to this bike compared to the prior generation Epic. Obviously, find that anywhere, but the new bike is about 10 millimeters longer in reach across all sizes. It's also a touch lower and over 1 degree degree slacker. Travel's bumped up 10 to 20 millimeters to 120 mil total. We all know that. Interestingly, this is the part I really want to touch on. The Evo and non-Evo version of the frame are exactly the same. Same geometry, same travel, same everything. The only delineator between the Evo and non-Evo models would be the component package they come with. This is a bit of a change from the Evo moniker in other models. Final point to make here, Specialized did build in a nifty little device into the headset to help prevent your bars from flipping around and damaging your top tube or controls in the event of a crash. It is removable, and for people like me who run higher bars, it's not even a concern. My controls can't hit the top tube regardless, so take that for what it's worth. Enough with the nerding out. How'd the bike ride? In the uphill direction, the bike was exactly as one would expect. It was efficient, no discernible movement from the rear suspension during hard-seated pedaling efforts. Even out of the saddle, it wasn't bad. The new bike does have higher anti-squat properties, and I think it shows. I'd suggest this is an area the Epic 8 is ahead of the pack. This side of a long road climb, gravel climb, that sort of thing, where I was out of the saddle for a while, I never touched the lockout front or rear. Chassis stiffness was also very apparent, with a feeling that all of my pedaling input was going to the rear wheel, not to the chassis. Fit felt pretty good, though I did bring the bars up. That's common across all bikes I tend to buy. And I'd say the last thing with fit is the seat is god awful. I have no idea what kind of creature or alien butt this thing was designed for, but yeah, it's probably the worst saddle I've ever tested out of 25 years of riding bikes. Or maybe it's longer now. Moving on to the fun part, how'd the bike do in the downhill direction? Well, as I implied at the start of this review, it's nothing revolutionary. A few years ago, like I kind of implied, I'd be raving about this bike. But since I've kind of come to expect this kind of performance out of a flex day 120 mil bike, it's got a distinct feeling coming from the rear end. All the flex day bikes tend to have that muted, more dead feeling. Those that don't know what I'm talking about, a flex day bike actually requires the seat stay of the rear suspension to flex in order for the wheel to go through its travel. You can actually observe this happening when the suspension cycles, and in my experience, that flex is actually kind of like a spring helper, which is one reason I feel you end up running a touch less pressure in a flex day bike compared to a non-flex day bike, keeping all other variables constant. Ultimately, I feel this application of the flex day design is appropriate here, but I'll be honest, small bump will suffer. In a way, this bike feels like it's got more compression damping than it does. That said, I do feel like the more I ride this thing, the more I appreciate how much mid-stroke support it has. It's really hard to tell when you only got 120 mil to work with, but I do notice this when I'm jumping the bike or I'm like hammering into a berm pretty hard. That said, I just want to be clear, it's a bit more muted compared to the designs without that flex day, with the additional pivot in the rear triangle. Turning to handling, the bike's excellent. It's like the Spur. It corners incredibly well, and as long as the trail is not like super ragged or rough, it encourages the rider to really work the bike, pumping things, manualing, doubling trail obstacles, that sort of thing. Super fun. The more I rode the bike, the more I realized something that is probably obvious to everybody watching this, but trail selection really matters. If I went beyond the capabilities of this bike, I found myself really having to slow down and focus more on not crashing, less on having fun. What's hard to parse here is the limit isn't that obvious, especially considering the bike's geometry, stoutness, and frankly, incredible fork performance. I only point this out because I want to make it clear, this is a 120 mil bike, and you're not going to confuse its downhill performance with that of a good enduro or even a good trail bike when things get rougher. On the flip side, it's a lot more fun on smoother, flatter trails than a lot longer travel bike will be, which is frankly true for all the 120 mil, bikes like it out there. This brings me to the Evo versus non-Evo part of this review. Unlike other bikes in the company's lineup, I don't feel like there's much separating these two models. To be honest, I'd make this decision less based on how aggressive you are and more based on your own weight. I know that sounds a little weird, but hear me out. I'm heavier, so the bigger code brakes, slightly longer travel, burlier fork, and bigger tires probably are less of a penalty and more appropriate for me. If you're lighter, the lighter parts will probably suit you just fine, and I'm not convinced the bike is really any less capable in the 120 mil fork configuration. Moving on to the biggest question I try to answer with every review. Who is this bike for? Well, I think my use case is about perfect. I'm a guy that wants a fun and efficient short travel bike that can also be raced in the occasional cross-country event. I also have more than one bike, so I'm not limited by the downhill cap of this bike. The Epic 8 is a great tool to have in my garage, and I was even able to eke out a win at a very, very, very grassroots cross-country race a few weeks back, something I couldn't have done on my 39-pound Stumpy Evo. But what if you can only afford one bike? Well, do you race? If you do, but you still want something that's more fun on the trail than a purebred cross-country bike, this should probably be on a short list. If you do pick up a second set of race wheels with lighter race tires, this will probably suffice for racing unless you are truly an aspiring pro. On the other hand, if you don't race and you don't mind taking it easy on the hairier downhills, or you live somewhere like Bend, this is probably a killer bike to do it all with. That said, consider the Chisel if you aren't racing and that you get similar performance at a mild weight penalty at a lower price. If you live somewhere with rowdier trails and you still want like better uphill capabilities than a true enduro bike, again, not caring about racing, I'd check out something in the 130, 140, even 150 mil range. It's going to be a lot more forgiving and frankly more versatile, again, so long as you aren't racing. In closing, perhaps the best indication about how I feel about a bike is if I have plans on selling it. This bike has held together very, very well despite hundreds of thousands of vertical feet of ascending and descending, and I really don't think there's anything better than the Epic 8 out there at the moment. Again, as good, yes. Better, no. This bike is very good. It's just late to a kind of crowded party. At this point, there are a lot of bikes, or at least a number of bikes, that are like the Epic 8 out there, and this one doesn't do anything extraordinarily well compared to the others, which fortunately and unfortunately is becoming true across really all bikes these days. We've sort of plateaued with respect to performance, which is ultimately okay. You don't have to go rush out and buy a new bike every year because they got so much better than the year before. This should keep you and your pocketbook a little happier. As always, thanks to all the viewers out there. If you have any questions, please throw them in the comments and I'll do my best to answer. Cheers, everybody.